Great. Well, thank you so much, first of all, to the organizers for setting up this really wonderful workshop, and thank you for having me here. So the paper that I pre-circulated with my co-author, Bianca Cipollaro, is part of a broader project on counterspeech. So counterspeech, as we understand this notion, is communication that tries to counteract harm brought about by other speech. So this includes things like hate speech, stigmatizing speech, disinformation. And counterspeech is a really broad category. So it includes things like fact-checking, it includes publicly condemning hate speech and hate speakers, it includes expressing support to targets of that hate speech, people who are being stigmatized. Here we look at a really specific kind of counterspeech, which involves putting forward what we call counterstereotypical models. So these are representations of an individual that defies or doesn't conform to a prejudicial stereotype, right? And one of the distinctive things about counterstereotypical models relative to other kinds of counterspeech is this focus on particular individuals, right? Other kinds of counterspeech might involve making general claims about the groups that are being targeted, right? And our focus, the running example we have in this paper is the case of gender-related counterstereotypical models. So that might involve representing, for example, women in positions of political leadership in a context where there are prejudicial stereotypes that present those positions as male-dominated or male-centric. Having said that, I just want to emphasize that the use of counterstereotypical models as a kind of counterspeech is, of course, applicable to many other contexts, whether that includes, contexts surrounding migrants or members of the LGBTQ community, and so on. Now, the other thing I want to highlight is that this tactic, the use of counterstereotypical models, is not just relevant to contexts of illiberalism, but we think it's especially significant in those contexts for a number of reasons. So one reason is that counterspeech itself, we think, is especially important in those contexts for a couple of reasons. First, that contexts of illiberalism often involve the stigmatization of vulnerable minorities and of vulnerable groups. And the other reason is that many of the other tools we have for countering harmful speech can be less available or less safe to deploy in those contexts. So if you think of legal restrictions on hate speech, maybe we don't trust illiberal governments to deploy those with appropriate restraint. Okay. Another reason, this relates more to the particular case study we have here, has to do with gender regimes. So Eva Fodor of CEU has argued that illiberal governments often try to implement particular gender regimes, which often involve gender roles that are in tension with liberal ideals of equality of opportunity. So counterspeech that aims to challenge prejudicial gender roles seems especially important in contexts where there's a concerted effort to implement these gender regimes. And then finally, counterstereotypical models specifically are also often controversial in these contexts. So Fodor, for example, notes that one of Viktor Orban's first legislative acts in government was actually to repeal a legal requirement to eliminate gender stereotypes from early education. And that Fodor argues is because these counterstereotypical initiatives ran counter to Orban's preferred anti-liberal regime. So in that context, our aim here in relation to this discursive strategy is to articulate key functions and key pitfalls associated with the use of counterstereotypical models as a form of counterspeech, and then to articulate the parameters upon which these functions and pitfalls often depend. And this is both to guide real world practice of deploying these counterstereotypical models, but also to guide future empirical research on the design of these models. So turning first to the functions of counterstereotypical models, it might seem puzzling in the first instance to deploy counterstereotypical models in response to stereotypes. And it might seem puzzling because it's well recognized that stereotypes actually admit of exceptions, right? They very, very seldom make universal claims. And so simply highlighting a particular individual doesn't actually falsify or contradict a stereotype. And so you might think, well, actually, this is a form of counterspeech that isn't well suited to responding to stereotypes. Now, one response to that is to say, actually, this isn't just a problem of counterstereotypical models. Stereotypes are very difficult to falsify anyway. This is because they have very slippery truth conditions. They can mean very different things. Another response, and this is really the one that we pursue in the paper, is to try to identify other stereotype countering functions that we think counterstereotypical models are distinctively well placed to perform. And we emphasize two. These aren't meant to be exclusive, but one has to do with promoting action. Okay, so the thought here is that counterstereotypical models can serve as a tool both for inspiring and for guiding stereotype-defying action. The other has to do with stereotypical salience structures, right? So the thought here is that stereotypes tend to govern what is and isn't salient to us, right? So, for example, a stereotype about political leaders that is male-centric will affect, what are the prototypical examples of political leaders that spring to mind. It'll also affect what properties of individuals seem striking to us when we encounter those individuals. So the thought here is that in the context where there are these prejudicial stereotypes relating to political leadership, the gender of female politicians, other things being equal, will tend to be more salient. And these salient structures can coexist and often coexist even when people actively disbelieve stereotypes. So they can endure after a stereotype has been falsified, even though that's difficult to do. Now, in both cases, with respect to both of these functions, we argue that the particularity of counterstereotypical models is actually a strength rather than a liability. So with respect to these two functions, the fact that counterstereotypical models emphasize particular individuals can actually be an asset. Okay. Having said that, counterstereotypical models are also fraught with dangers and pitfalls. And so we try to articulate and distinguish between different kinds of problems that they encounter and to specify what the relations are between these problems. So just to run reasonably quickly through them, counterstereotypical models might simply not be deemed realistic by the audience. There might be a negative response to them in the sense that the audience might think that the stereotype-defying individual is deserving of reproach precisely because they defy the stereotype. Even when they're positively viewed, they might be compartmentalized as an exception to the rule, right? Which is a problem both because it means that the stereotype-defying individual doesn't challenge the stereotype, but also because it might strengthen the stereotype. This is the intuitive notion that the exception proves the rule. I'm happy to say a little bit more about how that process works. One problem that we spend quite a bit of time discussing has to do with salience. So the thought here is that counterstereotypical models are often designed in a way that intentionally or unintentionally makes the group identity of or the demographic properties of stereotype-defying individuals especially salient. And that salience can be problematic in a number of ways. Some of these are instrumental. So here the concern is often that that salience can reactivate the prejudicial stereotype that's being targeted in a way that tends to exacerbate the problems that I've already mentioned. Some of the problems are more intrinsic. So this is the thought that people like Ella Whiteley or Jesse Munton have recently articulated, that in some cases, excessive salience of demographic properties can be disrespectful of the agency of individuals being represented. So making the gender of female politicians very salient can in some cases be disrespectful to those politicians. Counterstereotypical models can also misrepresent reality. So they can involve idealizing the individuals being represented. They can gloss over imperfections to make them more likable or more likely to inspire counterstereotypical action. This can be a problem both for concerns about deception, but also because it can undermine the guidance function of these counterstereotypical models if they misrepresent reality. And then finally, they can also, so these models can also set an excessive standard for members of the relevant group. So the thought here is that these models in practice often pick out individuals whose achievements are unusually impressive. And what that can do inadvertently often is set an unfairly demanding standard for group members. It can inadvertently send the message that in order to occupy these positions, actually members of this group have to do more than members of other groups. Okay, so there are all kinds of problems that counterstereotypical models can face. What we try to do based on this analysis is identify some key parameters that can influence to what extent these problems apply. And these, again, aren't meant to be exhaustive, but we argue in short that how far the pitfalls I've just mentioned apply depends notably on the audience, of course, of the counterstereotypical model, to what extent the individual is presented as normal or attainable or representative of the group in question, to what extent it's accurate in the sense of accurately representing reality. And then the final one, which has been less discussed and which we spend more time discussing, has to do with what feature the model is organized around. So this is a notion from the philosophy of psychology and cognitive science, which suggests that a representation is organized around a feature to the extent that features of that representation are explained by this central feature, right? So here you can have a distinction between representations of, for example, female politicians that are really organized around the gender of the female politician, and you can have representations where that is not the case, right? That their self-presentation is not organized around gender. And we think that that is one way to alleviate concerns about salience that I raised earlier. Now, we examine, and I'll be brief in closing here, we examine, having outlined these parameters, we examine some challenges in terms of applying them. So some of these are practical challenges. When you think of the audience, for instance, sometimes it might be difficult to know who is in our audience. We might not have much control over that audience. But even when individually the parameters can readily be applied, one important concern that we try to articulate is that actually these parameters can pull in opposite directions in some cases. So for example, there might be tensions between requirements of accuracy on the one hand and presenting the stereotype defying individual as normal on the other hand. This might be because in non-ideal contexts, individuals who succeed in defying or succeed in overcoming unfair odds often might be unusually talented or unusually impressive. There can also be tension between the requirement of accuracy and the requirement of not organizing these models around demographic properties. And that's because, again, in real world contexts, stereotype defying individuals very often are treated in ways that render their group identity salient. So we don't want to suggest that there's a single best way of designing counter-stereotypical models. That's because the different functions and the different pitfalls of counter-stereotypical models might have different weights in different contexts. But what we do want to highlight is that these normative trade-offs exist, even though empirical research on counter-stereotypical models is almost silent on them. And so however we choose to resolve them, they should closely inform the design of counter-stereotypical models. Okay. Now, just in closing, the last implications really of this paper are to do with empirical research. We want to use this analysis to highlight, both implications for how to conceptualize and measure the effectiveness of these models. So here we want to suggest that empirical studies should distinguish between the aim of inspiring action and the aim of guiding action. Studies tend not to do this. It's important to distinguish between these two aims because actually, again, for the reasons I've just outlined, they can pull in opposite directions. And likewise, sometimes in measurements of effectiveness, some studies look at tendency to promote action. Some of them look at the tendency to displace salient structures. Again, these can pull in opposite directions. And so we want to see how do these forms of effectiveness compare with particular interventions. And then finally, in terms of the determinants of effectiveness, many of the parameters we talk about have had some examination in existing empirical literature. The one that really empirical literature has been pretty much silent about is the significance of not being organized around a particular feature. So to what extent we choose to center or decenter the group identity or the demographic properties of the individuals being represented. So I'll leave things here, but thank you for your attention.